All right, so welcome everybody to another month of PCL Reads. Your co-host here is Amy. I'm at the Washington Park Library currently right now, and Lee is also here tonight as well. So the fabulous duo we are running PCL Reads. And this evening, I'm happy to say we are virtually traveling to my library, to Washington Park Library, and it will be hosted by, not me this time, it will be hosted by my children's librarian, Kevin. So we're super excited about that. So I'm going to hand things over to Kevin so he can highlight the Washington Park Library. So I'll stop talking. Kevin, on to you.
Great. Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. I'm super excited to represent Washington Park Library today. Amy, should I go over stuff now or later at the end of the talk? Now? So we got a couple of wonderful things happening at Washington Park currently. We have a wonderful face painting and magic party coming up next Thursday. Super excited about that. There'll be henna and live music. We have some of our regular occurring programming. We have Choose Your Own Adventure Book Club happening on Mondays. And then we have some story times on Tuesdays and Fridays. And we also have Reader's Theater on Thursday. All of it's so much fun. And then we also have our wonderful maker space on Thursday. So there's always a ton of stuff going on in person at the Washington Park Library. So I'm super excited to let you guys know about that. I'll go into a quick intro of Marilyn Chase, who I'm super excited to be connecting with for this event. Marilyn has been 2 decades as a reporter writing for the Wall Street Journal. She lives out in Southern California, and she did a little change and she's taught creative writing both at UCLA and at UC Berkeley, and a lecturer over there. And she came across the Ruth Asawa archives at the Stanford Library. And the way she described it, it just seemed like a treasure trove. And I can't imagine running across something like that and then wanting to, first of all, just go through it and then wanting to make it accessible. And I think that that's been the biggest joy for me in reading this book is watching all the narrative strands that kind of connect Ruth's life into her work and how it all goes back and forth, almost as a tapestry or a weaving, something you could imagine Ruth doing herself. So I'm super excited that we're doing this book today. I really enjoyed it, and I think that everyone's going to be super excited to hear this talk today. With that, I'll pass it on over to Marilyn.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and all of you at Providence Community Library and PCL Reads for inviting me to join you today. I'm very excited, and I especially want to thank you for holding space for books and books about artists who are heroes of American culture in spite of multiple obstacles to their realizing their dreams. I have to say that I came to this project in the summer of 2014. It seems like quite a while ago, although it passed in the blink of an eye. I was reading, as reporters do, about new items in archives, and I was incredibly fascinated to learn that the family of the artist Ruth Asawa had given her papers, her archives, to Stanford University, which is actually my alma mater, not UCLA, although I'm a big fan, having been born in LA, I'm a big fan of UCLA and the whole UC system, where I now teach at the sister campus of Berkeley. But I found it irresistible that there were 275 boxes of the artist's letters and papers and sketches and designs and plans for works of art, and also plans for making art accessible to the public, particularly public school children, who it was her special care to bring into the joy of creativity. And so now, if I can share screen through the magic of Zoom, and we'll hope that the tech gods are with us. Yes, I will introduce you to my sort of role as scribe and and storyteller in the Life of Ruth Asawa. So I think fundamentally I was drawn to her story as a kind of hero's journey. And I hope that that doesn't sound trite, but in this case, it's really true. I could tell the story of Asawa, who surmounted a childhood in the Great Depression on a poor truck farm. Asawa, the survivor of a World War II prison camp in Arkansas, and Asawa for having navigated her way through a racist post-war society and who blossomed as a fully realized artist, living her own code of creativity, family love, and boundless dedication to public service to her society. So let me introduce you to the young Ruth as I first encountered her in those archives at Stanford. Here's a picture of Ruth at the age of 13, most likely a school picture. And this is how I met her in my research. She was the middle child of 7, born in 1926 near Los Angeles in the tiny city of Norwalk, which was then actually very rural and small. It's now a big suburb of LA. A child of the Great Depression, she had to pull her weight in the fields, helping and harvest and take to market the crops grown by her parents. Side by side with her siblings, they worked from dawn to dusk. The family was so poor that in order to build the family's farmhouse, her father had to recycle old nails, straightening them out for reuse. In school, Ruth loved to draw, paint, and cartoon, but at home, she, of necessity, had to focus her energies on planting the onions and looping the string beans on a trellis. But even out in the fields, she expressed her creative drive by tracing figure eights in the dirt behind her father's farm wagon as she rode on the back of that wagon with her feet hanging off into the soil. She would take the wire tags from vegetable crates and untwist them and braid them into designs for rings and bracelets. All of these skills, looping those string beans, tracing the figure eights, and fashioning beautiful things out of cast off wire would all find their way into her art. But as all of you know from your history books, in December of 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor drew the US into World War II, changing life for the Asawa family among 120,000 other people in the Japanese American community. When President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, the roundups began. In February 1942, 2 FBI agents descended on the Asawa's farm and arrested Mr. Asawa as he tended his strawberry crop. The FBI gave him just enough time to eat his lunch while his daughters pressed his best black suit, and off they went, whisking him to an undisclosed interrogation site and later on to an enemy alien camp in Lordsburg, New Mexico. For many months, the family didn't know his whereabouts. And it seems from my reading of the National Archives file on Mr. Asawa that the main thing that attracted their attention and their suspicion was the simple fact that he had sent his children to learn kendo, or the art of Japanese fencing. Somehow kendo struck the FBI as a sign of militancy. And so Mr. Asawa, nearing retirement age, all 135 pounds of his frame was sent into an enemy alien camp for the duration of the war. That April, Ruth and her mother and siblings were ordered to report to an assembly center at the Santa Anita racetrack near Los Angeles, where they were numbered and assigned to sleeping quarters in, of all things, a horse stable. So the quarters for Seabiscuit and other prize-winning thoroughbreds now became human habitation, which had been given a coat of somewhat slapdash whitewash paint and a thin coat of linoleum over the packed earthen floors that still bore traces of the animal odors from their recent occupants. The only bright spot in this grim scene was that Ruth's fellow prisoners included 3 Japanese American artists from Disney Studios. They were Tom Okamoto, Chris Ishii, and James Tanaka. And these men had worked on some of Disney's most famous animated features like Pinocchio and Snow White. They were inspiring role models for Ruth, and they supplied her and other students at Santa Anita with paper and drawing instruments and lessons in things like perspective. But after 6 months at Santa Anita, the Asawa family and thousands of others were transferred to a permanent venue for their wartime incarceration. Theirs was the easternmost, most remote camp on the map called Rower Relocation Center in Rower, Arkansas. There they lived in tar paper barracks with communal toilets, mess halls, rudimentary classrooms, and in a grim prison camp enclosed by barbed wire and gun towers with spotlights, like the gun tower that you see here. Officials said these gun towers were for the inmates' own safety. But if that were true, the young Ruth wondered, then why were the guns always pointed inward toward the captives, whose only crime was looking like the enemy? Well, here you can see teenage Ruth standing in front of those tar paper barracks. People were only able to bring with them what they could carry. And with belongings so spare, Ruth wrote that the most precious things her mother carried from home were seeds. And many families planted these little tiny gardens in front of their barracks to give them a touch of home. Ruth standing beside this trellis sort of reminds us of her farm chore, which was looping the string beans. And it was a skill that would forecast, in some ways, the looped wire of her sculptures. Reflecting back on her war years, Ruth later would say, "Art saved us." She used the time that she no longer had to spend toiling in the fields of her family's farm to create artwork. And here's one of Ruth's student paintings done in her camp years. It's a watercolor of the sort of moody bayou landscape surrounding the barracks. She also did a watercolor of sumo wrestling, which, along with baseball and softball, was one of the sports that was actually allowed in this very restrictive camp setting. They were prohibited from having radios or cameras, which were considered contraband. So Ruth drew the members of her high school graduating class. Not surprisingly, she was voted the most artistic girl. On graduating from Rower High School in 1943, Ruth was issued this ID card for indefinite leave. It's an image that's now housed at the Smithsonian Institution's Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Ruth was released to attend college in the Midwest. With the war still on, college-bound seniors could leave camp for college so long as they stayed away from the West Coast, which was still regarded by the government as a sensitive military zone. She picked Milwaukee State Teachers College, where she could study to become an art teacher for the fabulous sum of $25 a semester, funded with a Quaker scholarship and her earnings as a live-in maid and nanny. It seemed like a bargain, but it wasn't. After 3 years of hard college work, which she enjoyed, by the way, she was barred from the fourth year, which, as everyone knows who's studied for a degree in education, includes student teaching. Well, this was due to racist rejection of any Japanese American student teacher by the public schools in Wisconsin. So she was denied her degree and credential and effectively sent away empty-handed without a ticket to the practical professional pathway that she had envisioned. However, some good friends in Milwaukee had urged her to follow them on to Black Mountain College. That was a school in North Carolina, an experimental art-centered institution where some of the pioneers of modern art were gathering to teach a new generation of artists. And with her practical career pathway to teaching blocked by bias, there was now nothing to stop her from pursuing her heart's desire and real dream of becoming a working artist. So off she went. At Black Mountain, she found an experimental art lab amid students, teachers, and visiting artists of all colors and backgrounds. One of her first roommates was a Black painter and collagist, Mary Park Washington, who took this photo and whom I was privileged to interview recently before she died. The young art students learned from greats like the painter Joseph Albers, the modern dancer Merce Cunningham, and the composer John Cage. Ruth enrolled right away in color and design with Albers, who became a lifelong mentor. She planned on staying for one summer session, and she ended up studying there 3 years. Well, here you can see Joseph Albers presiding over his classroom. An emigre who fled Germany when the Nazi Party closed the Bauhaus, the famous art center. Albers taught students to, as he liked to say, open their eyes and see, and to approach their craft with respect and humility. He also invoked certain Zen principles of design, such as yin and yang, which you see up on the board just above his arm. He struck an immediate chord with Ruth because of his embrace of Zen principles. Albers was also a stern taskmaster, and not everyone thrived under his rule. And the story goes that Albers even refused to meet with Ruth until she cleaned up her studio, but she complied with his orders, and after that they bonded over painting, color studies, and their mutual reverence for craft. In this slide, you can see another one of Ruth's beloved Black Mountain mentors, Buckminster Fuller, the futurist, engineer, and the inventor of the geodesic dome. Ruth loved Fuller's sculptural geometries and his philosophy of living with less on spaceship Earth. She would later bring Fuller into San Francisco classrooms to share his designs and his ideas with students. Here's a watercolor from Asawa's Black Mountain Days, where you can see the influence of Albers' vibrant color studies and abstract forms, in this case, suggesting dancers' bodies. If you look real closely, you may be able to make out a little figure in the lower left with her arms raised. Here's another of Ruth's student watercolors, a study of leaves that also shows the influence of Albers' color studies, as well as watercolor washes that Ruth Asawa loved to do. This sort of poetic portrait of Ruth Asawa in the snow at Black Mountain was taken by her college classmate, Hazel Larson Archer. One of the joys of being in art school at Black Mountain was being close to nature near the Blue Ridge Mountains. Students often went on hikes with their professors and with their classmates. The trails wound through a very romantic spot known as the Garden of Eden. And on one of these walks, Ruth ran into a new architecture student from Georgia by the name of Albert Lanier. Ruth was unlike anyone that this young Southern man had ever seen, and he was immediately swept off his feet. In addition to their personal chemistry, they shared certain academic and artistic perks from being together. He helped her with her math homework, and she advised him on the design of his architectural projects. And before long, the two young people who had really never even dated much anymore were a couple on campus. In this idyllic artistic community, supported by their mentors and many progressive free thinkers, their love for one another outshone all the social obstacles that lay ahead of them. But before leaving Black Mountain, Ruth and Albert started planning their future together, in spite of some family resistance and indeed legal bans on mixed marriages that were prevalent in so many states of our country at the time. So they asked for blessings from their teachers, Joseph Albers and Buckminster Fuller. Ruth went to Albers and asked whether he thought she could be an artist and have a family of 6 children, her dream family. Remember, this was in 1948. Albers reportedly replied, yeah, you have babies, that is your art. But he told her fiance, Albert, never let her stop doing her art. Buckminster Fuller, for his part, gave the young couple his wholehearted blessing and compared their future path together to an oyster creating a pearl around a grain of sand. Fuller also designed Ruth's wedding ring, which is shown here, made from a river stone enclosed by silver bands, shaped sort of like interlocking A's in Asawa. Between their engagement and their marriage, Ruth and Albert had to spend a year apart. While she finished art school at Black Mountain, Albert moved on to San Francisco to prepare for an architecture career. During this time, they poured all their love, fears, and doubts into letters. One of the joys and surprises of getting to do this project was being allowed to read and quote from these love letters between two young artists who were not only exceptionally gifted in the visual arts and architecture, but also unusually poetic in their written expression. If for no other reason than that, I hope you'll all get to read my book to hear their voices as they work out their plans to transcend the challenges of living in mid-century America and fulfill their amazing artistic ambitions and love story together. Well, Albert had heard that young artists could live in San Francisco quite cheaply, even getting a 3-course dinner with red wine for 75 cents. Now, that wasn't quite true, but it is true that the city was fairly progressive and welcoming to a penniless bohemian young couple who moved into a barren 60-foot-long loft without walls or kitchen over an onion warehouse. They thought it was heaven. Just in time, the California State Supreme Court abolished this state's laws against interracial marriage. So Ruth and Albert were able to exchange their wedding views in their loft before a small circle of family and friends without hitchhiking to Reno. True to her dream of having a family of 6 children, Ruth wasted little time in starting their family. And here you can see Ruth and Albert holding their daughter Aiko on the left and their son Xavier. 4 more children would follow: Hudson, Adam, Addie, and Paul, fulfilling Ruth's dream family, all within the decade that she launched her studio art practice. She and Albert were trailblazers in so many ways in making a marriage of true equals, combining art and architecture and family, and blending 4 biological children and 2 adopted children into a seamlessly close-knit and harmonious family circle. Well, by the early 1950s, Ruth Asawa was breaking boundaries of conventional sculpture with her signature looped wire hangings. She had learned this basic technique of looping wire during a student service trip to Mexico. There she had met local craftsmen who looped wire baskets to take their eggs and produce to the marketplace. Ruth took that basic looping technique and enlarged it beyond the utilitarian to make these long, undulating sculptures with multiple layers and forms within forms, in which the outside turns inward to become the inside and back again. Her art is also transformative, turning an unlovely industrial material used for fences, including those barbed wire enclosures that she saw in camp, into these transparent suspended mesh creations. It's just our good luck also that a chance meeting at a work site brought Ruth's family into contact with the family of photographer Imogen Cunningham, who left us a treasury of iconic images of Ruth Asawa with her sculptures, as you see here. Here's another woven wire hanging, combining aluminum and brass for a sort of shimmering silver and gold effect. You can imagine at a time when most sculpture was made by men out of wood or stone or steel anchored to the ground, Ruth Asawa's weightless creations were so different. They were radically new, and some critics didn't even think they were sculpture at all and refused or resisted exhibiting them. But the Peridot Gallery in Manhattan began showing her work in the mid-50s, exposing her to important collectors, such as the Rockefeller family and the architect Philip Johnson. Now, of course, Asawa's work is found in many venues, including the De Young Museum in San Francisco, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the David Zwirner Gallery in New York, and many more, including a number of European museums and gallery venues this year and next. Along with closed spheres and oval hangings, Ruth experimented with openwork sculpture. And this form was one created by accident. It seems that while looping a sculpture, Ruth made a mistake that couldn't be untangled. Instead, it had to be cut. Well, instead of ruining the work, as you might think, it seems that the weight of the hanging sculpture changed the surface completely, opening up these cut edges into windows with flared edges. Serendipity played a big role in her artistic inventions. Well, here you can see another portrait by Cunningham of Asawa, showing her intensity while working to form a looped wire sculpture with a coil of wire on the left. And you can notice that the index finger of her right hand is bound with masking tape. And that was to protect her fingers from being cut while sculpting. These sculptures may look ethereal and light, but the edges are very abrasive and sharp. Here's another looped wire sculpture that's lighted to show the sort of intricate shadow play of the pieces. Sometimes the light and shadow let us best appreciate the intricacy of these forms within forms, revealing inner contours and layers that curve in and out, rather like an amoeba strip. This portrait of Ruth on her back at work shows us the mammoth scale of some of her pieces. The longest of her looped wire hangings actually stretches to 21 feet long. If you look very closely, you can see the wedding ring by Buckminster Fuller on her left hand. It's to the right of the image. This is an image that's one of many people's favorites, and it shows Ruth sculpting amid her growing family. Unlike many of her female contemporaries on the modern art scene who sacrificed having the rewards of a personal family life for their art, Ruth intentionally went in the opposite direction. She actually chose a large family, and she chose to make her studio at home so that there would be no walls between art and life or work and family. She wanted very much for her children to see her at work making art. And imagine, she even declined an offer by a design firm to hire her a housekeeper and a nanny so that she could boost her output. I wonder how many of us would have the discipline to be able to refuse an offer like that. She wanted all aspects of her life to be integrated into an organic whole. And the family continued to grow. Here's Ruth and Albert surrounded by their 6 children, Xavier, Iko, Hudson, Adam, Addie, and the youngest Paul, who is shown riding a toy horse. I'm often asked if her children also pursued creative occupations, and the answer is yes. Iko is a painter, Xavier, Hudson, and Adam became builders, Addie wrote and taught, and Paul is a fine art ceramicist. This portrait of 1964 shows Ruth demonstrating the traditional art of origami, or folded paper, to the then 4-year-old Paul, who seems totally absorbed in his mom's lesson. Asawa's art practice was inseparably bound up with her vocation as an art educator, starting with kids' crafts around the kitchen table and later expanding into the schools and the community at large. This installation shot of Ruth at the San Francisco Museum of Art, now known as the SF MoMA, shows us the great variety and tremendous productivity of Asawa as she sculpted. She continued to make looped wire sculptures well into the late 1990s when she was in her 70s, but she kept evolving new forms, as we'll see in the next image. In 1962, a friend of Ruth's went to the desert and brought back a sort of spiky, tumbleweed-looking plant for Ruth as a gift. She took on a challenge from this friend, the photographer Paul Hassel, who asked if she thought she could draw it. The structure of the radiating branches was so dense and complex that she decided to sculpt it instead. This experiment led to Asawa's tied wire sculptures. Some are tree forms set on bases, as you can see here, and others are star-shaped hangings suspended from the ceiling or mounted on the wall. Asawa didn't neglect representational art either. In fact, her first public commission was this fountain titled Andrea, popularly known as the Mermaid Fountain. and it's the centerpiece of the courtyard in Ghirardelli Square on San Francisco's waterfront. Its debut sparked a lively controversy after the square's main architect denounced the work as mere kitsch and Disney-esque. She hated the publicity that this scandal generated. But if anything, the architect's critical mermaid manifesto, as he called it, only made her fountain more popular and beloved by the public. And it helped propel Asawa, who became known as San Francisco's fountain lady, to even greater prominence. This year of 1968 also brought another milestone. Asawa began noticing her kids coming home from school with ditto sheets to color in as art, Thanksgiving turkeys and Easter bunnies and the like. She thought that the schools could and should be doing a lot better, so she led a group of volunteers and parents in launching the Alvarado Arts Project, an elementary summer school crafts program that eventually went year-round and citywide. Although she never did receive her credential, this began her vocation as an art educator and advocate. Ruth, shown here at a school arts festival, gave decades of her energy and passion to children. The National Endowment of the Arts recognized her work in a report that declared Ruth and her colleagues were building what they called a city of gold with their activism benefiting children in the arts. Asawa spoke very little in public about her camp years. She was not an overtly or explicitly political person. But in 1994, she got the chance to tell the story of her generation in bronze. She received a commission from the city of San Jose, California, to sculpt this monumental work, the Japanese American Internment Memorial. And here is just one detail of the 5 by 14-foot wall, double-sided, in bronze bas-relief, depicting the Japanese American community around World War II. You see the camps, the guard tower, the barbed wire, the barracks, and the imprisoned families. The detail I think I love best is in the upper right-hand corner. If you look closely, you may just be able to make out a tiny little paper airplane that it was the habit of some of the children incarcerated inside to sail over that barbed wire to freedom before they were released. Next, you get a peek at the work in progress. Here you see the trio of artists who were behind this memorial in a photograph by their friend, the photographer Terry Schmidt. The original of this work was actually created in material known as baker's clay. And Asawa worked on it with her son Paul, shown here on the right, and her colleague Nancy Thompson, shown on the left, before a section of the original. Baker's clay is, of course, material made from a simple recipe of flour, salt, and water. And Asawa used this and developed it for children's use at home and also in the schools. It was cheap, it was non-toxic, it was virtually inexhaustible, and you didn't have to have a big budget. But she also liked to use it in her own work to create originals. After the artist sculpted the Internment Memorial original in baker's clay, it was later cast in bronze using the ancient lost wax method at the Artworks Foundry in Berkeley, California. Today, the piece stands before the federal courthouse in San Jose, California. And if you're ever in the Bay Area, it's well worth a trip to see this piece in person, since no photo of a detail can really capture the grandeur and sweep of it. While always exploring new forms and fusing them with traditional Japanese methods, Asawa also transformed origami, or folded paper, into designs for sculptures. This piece is one of 2 fountains in the Japantown Peace Plaza in San Francisco. Originally made from steel, pleated into a form resembling a lotus, the first version of this piece from 1976 rusted beyond repair, and so the 2 twin fountains were recast in bronze and reinstalled in Japantown in 1999. Here's another origami-inspired sculptured fountain called Aurora for the Goddess of the Dawn. Asawa used stainless steel in a really gorgeous fountain facing the Embarcadero of San Francisco, framing the rising sun over the East Bay Hills. This particular sculpture, installed around her 60th birthday, is also of interest because it followed Asawa's diagnosis with the autoimmune condition lupus. Among an array of symptoms, Asawa experienced numbness and some loss of strength that left her quite disabled for most of the year 1985. She endured strong treatment with chemotherapy drugs and steroids that were intended to damp down her overactive immune system, and eventually did help her achieve a remission. But it was a difficult recovery and a challenging time, and all while recovering, she was often sleepless from the steroids and stayed up all night writing and planning sculptures. Her nocturnal writings were full of insights about her life, her art, her philosophy, and even snatches of poetry. In the year 1989, Ruth Asawa became the first artist appointed to serve on the DeYoung Museum's Board of Trustees. She shook up the staid and somewhat formal trustees' meetings and routines by bringing paper and teaching all her fellow trustees how to make origami. After an earthquake damaged the old museum structure and plans got underway to build a new DeYoung Museum, Asawa took a pivotal role helping not only raise funds, but also working with the then director, Harry S. Parker Jr., Harry S. Parker III, and architects to ensure that education would have a central place in the new museum's striking new tower. Its opening in 2006 featured a Ruth Asawa retrospective exhibition titled Contours in the Air. And if you ever visit her website, ruthasawa.com, you can see some gorgeous installation shots by her son-in-law, Lawrence Cuneo, that give you the experience of walking through that exhibition. Asawa also gifted 15 of her wire sculptures to the museum for permanent display in the Tower Lobby Gallery, shown here during the annual Bouquets to Art event. The gallery is one of the DeYoung Museum's 4 areas that are always free to the public, something that I'm sure pleased her immensely, as she thought that art should be for everyone, not just the elite. Well, here you can see a sort of sweet and nostalgic portrait of Albert and Ruth as a couple in their later years. They were married for almost 6 decades, partners in art as in love, supporting each other's work and advocacy for the public schools. They fought bureaucracy for decades to ensure that children were given every opportunity to express their creativity. They helped raise $150 million in bond funds toward renovating a new home for the Ruth Asawa San Francisco School of the Arts, which whose origins Ruth spearheaded and which was later named in her honor. Her dream of moving the school downtown near the Civic Center Arts Hub remained an elusive goal, and it was sort of their great unfinished symphony. And it still waits today for an angel with matching funds and the political will to get it done. One of my secret hopes is that my book might reignite some interest in getting this project achieved. Here, Ruth and Albert are shown pausing to rest in their garden, and it's kind of a poetic through line in their story together that having met in the Garden of Eden at Black Mountain College, they gardened together throughout their life as a married couple. Well, I like to round out my talks by showing you this sculpture from 1970 that went on to make art market history in the 2000s. Ruth Asawa's work throughout her 87 years of life was so prolific and her public service so nonstop that it literally staggers the imagination. And her star has never dimmed in San Francisco. So it may surprise you to learn that she didn't always enjoy the same renown nationwide. Given the evolving art movements in New York, though, where collectors had embraced her in the 1950s, her work became partially eclipsed by 2000 by other trends and fads. And in my book, I get to tell a wonderful story about how a chance phone call from the family alerted a New York curator who didn't know Asawa to her work. When he discovered the images of Asawa's sculpture, he recognized that there was a true neglected genius here. and he saw an opportunity to relaunch her in the New York and world art arenas. That curator, whose name is Jonathan Labe, put this sculpture up for auction at Christie's Auction House in 2013, where it surpassed all estimates to set a then record of $1.4 million, which is pretty striking when you consider that at the beginning of her career, Ruth would actually rent you one of her sculptures for the vast sum of $20 a month. Well, this bittersweet auction milestone came just months before Ruth Asawa died at the age of 87. Mr. Labe, who now represents Asawa's estate for the David Zwirner Gallery, continues to drive her posthumous career trajectory by mounting Asawa retrospectives in the US and in England. Plans call for an exhibition, Ruth Asawa, Citizen of the Universe, at Modern Art Oxford in England and at the Stavanger Art Museum in Norway in 2022. Asawa's sculpture is also now part of a big group show, Women in Abstraction, which is now at the Pompidou Museum in Paris, traveling on to the Guggenheim Art Museum in Bilbao, Spain in 2022. And those auction values? Well, they've continued to soar, with an Asawa wire sculpture fetching a hammer price of $5.4 million at a Christie's auction in July of 2020. That's kind of an ironic footnote for an artist who cared so little about her market values or material things. Recently, the story of Ruth Asawa has also exploded on 2 additional media platforms. Here you can see the Google Doodle that debuted in May 2019, when the site celebrated her work with this sketch. And if you do internet searches as often as I do, you'll know why this sketch triggered such a wave of searches that it temporarily crashed her own website. And most recently, the Ruth Asawa Forever stamp debuted last summer. On August 13th of 2020, the US Postal Service honored Asawa by issuing this beautiful set of 10 stamp designs depicting her signature wire creations. How apt for an artist who insisted that the art she made wasn't just for the elite, but for everyone. I just checked the USPS website, and sadly it seems that the Postal Service has sold out of the postage stamps in many venues, although it looks like you can still get envelopes with first date covers or a decorative sheet of these stamps covered in plastic online. But my local post office is definitely sold out. I have to say it was tempting to hoard my Asawa stamps, but I wanted them to circulate so widely, or as widely as possible, so that millions of Americans, if they all sent letters with these stamps, would get to see her images and come to know her work. So in closing this part of the program, I guess I would just like to say that getting to tell the story of Ruth Asawa, a story of art and love transcending hardship and hatreds, has moved and inspired me in a time of pandemic. She often said that she bore no bitterness for the war because it made her into who she was, and she liked who she was. She was a genius at art, gifted at turning swords into plowshares and barbed wire into sculpture. Spreading her legacy to new readers has been the honor of my lifetime. So thanks again to librarians and readers of Providence for hosting me today. And now I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. That was beautiful. I loved all the photos. The stamps are so cool. I did not know that at all.
Yep.
So I'm gonna hand things over to Kevin. I know he had a question that he wanted to ask you, and then we do have one question so far in the chat. We'll get to that one next. And anyone else who wants to add questions to the chat, feel free, and we'll call on you, and you can say hello, or we can just ask the question for you, whatever you're comfortable with. Kevin, on to you.
All right, great. Oh, so wonderful. I mean, so many questions. I mean, we could have a whole thing of just me questioning, but that'd be boring.
Kevin.
Fine by me. Fire away.
I just had a quick question. and it was mentioned in the book, and I was wondering, maybe because you are so familiar with the archival material, is it seemed that she had difficulty getting recognition for some of her works on paper and her works other than her wire sculpture. Did you, I remember that I read somewhere when she was showing in New York City that they were focusing on the wire sculptures, and she had wanted to have another show with some of her works on paper. Did you get any feel for that going through the archives, if she felt that she was pigeonholed?
Well, you're right. In the 50s, when she was showing her work at this gallery on Madison Avenue, New York City, the Peridot Gallery, spelled P-E-R-I-D-O-T, like the jewel. She was principally seen as a sculptor. And since Asawa was always wanting to explore new forms, and she loved doing work on paper, she loved painting, she loved watercolor, she loved drawing, she loved ink painting. As a little girl, she learned the art of brush painting and calligraphy as part of her cultural studies, her Japanese studies that her parents encouraged their children to pursue. So she was a many-faceted artist, but once having presented her to the public as a sculptor, the gallery where she was showing, which was a small gallery, wanted to stay focused, and she proposed in her letters to the gallery owner, Mr. Lewis Pollock. She proposed that they do a mixed exhibition of sculpture and works on paper. And he said, well, let's stay focused on art. And so by this time, she'd worked with them for a number of years, and she was getting a little bit weary of the pressures of not only being a little bit pigeonholed, feeling a little bit constrained. It was also a burden for an independent artist to undertake the risk and expense of shipping her work across the country. In those days, it was tremendously risky to ship a fragile sculpture. They would often become damaged en route, and so she sort of refocused her practice on her San Francisco studio at that point. But there are many beautiful works on paper, and nowadays we see museums are more than happy to show her works on paper, as well as her sculptures. Although the sculptures, the looped wire sculptures, the form within form sculptures, are seen as her signature creation, if you will.
Sure. Thank you. Looks like we have a question from Patricia. Patricia, do you want to unmute, or can we unmute Patricia to ask the question?
Actually, I was quite happy with you reading the question.
Oh, I can read.
You mentioned in your book that that she, along with other women sculptors, were virtually ignored in the post-war period and have since been recognized. Do you think that they have their work has any characteristics in common?
That's a great question. My tendency is to want to refer you to a curator, an art historian, to talk about formal, formal attributes of women in sculpture. You'll hear people talk about Ruth and other contemporaries, maybe Louise Nevelson, Louise Bourgeois. But to my eye, their works are very different. I always think of Nevelson's work as being those sort of large, black, sort of blockish, sort of cubist sculptures almost. And Nevelson's work being some of those, sort of mammoth spiders for which she's known. I've actually heard some curators and art historians compare her to Alice Neal, who is enjoying a tremendous renaissance right now with a lot of writing about her work. Alice Neal was a painter. Alice Neal also was a family person and a mother, and did a lot of portraits of people. Their work not being likened to one another's work for any formal attributes, perhaps, but more for the way in which they lived their lives. So I see Asawa's looped wire sculptures as being unique. There are other artists who work with fibers, weaving fibers, for example, Kei Sekimachi, who is a Berkeley-based fiber artist. But there's no one quite like Asawa, I think, for the sort of sensuousness of those curved forms. To my eye, at least. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks, Marilyn. Thanks, Patricia, for talking. Going back, we have Kenny. You asked a question earlier in the chat. So Kenny, do you want to ask your question live, or would you like me to read it? Lee can unmute you.
Sure. Yeah, I was just very, first of all, I just thought the book was just fascinating and I couldn't put it down, and I just loved her life, and her story was phenomenal. But I was wondering how involved was, she seemed to have such an incredible love story, and how involved was Albert with the children? He must have been pretty involved. And did any of your research uncover any of that involvement with the children?
I think if you ask Ruth's 5 surviving children today, they would tell you that their dad was a very hands-on father. Mm-hmm. He gardened with the children. They were, he was very involved in their school lives. Their family was known for was famous in their neighborhood for having very inclusive holidays and dinners. He was very much a presence in their life. He also set, in a more subtle way, I think he set an incredible example of, remember, this is a couple who got married in 1949, and they led such an egalitarian life together and partnership, and they set an example of that for their children, so that their children grew up seeing their mother and their father active and equal partners in the home and in their respective careers, which were both creative careers. Ruth, in a very sort of understated and natural way, was also kind of a homebody. She didn't feel that she had to, sort of shrug off the trappings of domesticity in order to be a fully realized creative artist. She loved cooking. She loved having guests to dinner. She would, prepare a meal and then run off to a school board meeting or a meeting of parents planning some new artistic venture in the schools. And then she'd be home, working all night on her artworks. So again, there was this idea that both mother and father merged art and life in the home. So I think they were both equal partners in parenthood as well. At least that's my sense of it. And their dad was also an incredible storyteller. He was a Southern yarn spinner in the great Southern tradition, and the children did an oral history with him and wrote down some of his funnier tales of growing up in the Georgia countryside and the characters that inhabited his little hometown. Ruth would travel to Georgia and do some community art projects with some of the folks that lived there and that knew his family.
Lee has a question.
Kevin. Yeah, so I'd love to see Asawa's work, and I was wondering where the closest, where I might see your work, perhaps a day trip or a weekend trip from Rhode Island.
Harvard has some of her work.
Excellent. Okay.
And the Whitney Museum of American Art has some work. There are pieces of hers in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York as well, although I'm not sure that they're on exhibition. But I would say, for starters, Harvard and the Whitney in New York would be good places to start.
Lee, you read my mind.
San Francisco.
Oh my gosh. I want watercolors, and I want to see your water sculptures. You know, the watercolors, just those colors. Oh my gosh. Oh, like they're
colors are amazing. And there are also some wonderful exhibition books that have gorgeous reproductions in them. I think my book has something like 66 plates. Chronicle Books did an amazing job of making the book so beautiful, but there's so much more. And just her botanical watercolors, her botanical studies of flowers are amazing. And she painted and drew all the time. If someone gave her a bouquet, she would sketch it, she would paint it. And even when she was in the hospital being treated for lupus, she was drawing and she was folding origami. So she was working, her hands were never still. If she went to a school board meeting, she would sketch the participants. And some of these sketches are also in the archive. But for starters, if you can't get out to all the museums right at once, check out some of the exhibition booklets, for example, Contours in the Air, and then some of the more recent ones done by the Werner Gallery. You can see my collection back there, but yeah.
Thank you.
So start there.
That's awesome. That's because, as you know, most Rhode Islanders do not like to travel. So this is good news. I think we can all make it up to Cambridge, though.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Get out of Rhode Island. Yeah, we'll head up to the faraway town of Boston and check out some.
That's right.
Check out some Asawa. Yeah, sounds
Yeah.
good.
The Harvard Museum, was it called the Bush Reininger? It may have changed names now, but check it out. They have some of her work. Yeah.
So Kevin, if you want to conclude us with one more of your fascinating list of questions, feel free, and then we can end for the evening after that.
Oh, okay. It might be out of your knowledge base, but I was just curious, does Ruth Asawa have any traction in Japan?
That's a really interesting question. Thanks for throwing me a softball there, Kevin.
Sorry,
as a reporter, I like to stick to my research base and not speculate. I have not heard if there's a movement or a groundswell. I would think it unfortunate if there weren't. There are lots of other cultural and sporting events going on just now in Japan, so maybe their interests and energies have to be focused elsewhere for a while. But I will tell you that in a surprise, my first international edition of my book will be coming out in a while. There will be a Korean edition of Everything She Touched coming out. So a lovely Korean American woman read the book and enjoyed it so much that she wanted some of her fellow Koreans to be able to read it, even if they didn't feel comfortable reading in English. So she got a publisher interested. So maybe that's the beginning of a groundswell of some more interest in Asawa in Asia. But I will say that Europe is all over Asawa this summer, and this year and next year. The exhibitions at Modern Art Oxford, at Stavanger in Norway, at the Pompidou in Paris, which is on now, and then the showing of women in abstraction coming up at the Bilbao Guggenheim Museum, which had to be put off a little bit because of the pandemic, are now, I think, finally happening. And I hope that the Delta variant won't set us back once again, but those are underway. So I will ask the family whether there's a movement afoot to get her more exposure in Japan. Interestingly, and I'll just close with that, Asawa didn't get to go to Japan until she was, I think, about 60 years old. And it was a special trip that she and her husband Albert and her friends had planned. It was going to be an autumn sketching trip, an autumn gardening and sketching trip. And she got very ill and was diagnosed and treated, and just managed to go into remission in time to take the trip. But unlike her brothers and sisters, she missed a chance due to family circumstances to study in Japan as a child. So she didn't get to go experience Japanese culture, which her family observed and kept alive in the home, as poor as they were. She didn't have that chance to go and study as a small child, as many of her generation did. So it was her first trip at the age of 60.
Wow.
And just because I absolutely love this question, I'm going to see if Lee can unmute Catherine, because it's a great ending question. Catherine, would you like to ask Marilyn your question?
Hi, Catherine.
Hi. So let's see. You obviously are in love with the book that you wrote, and the person featured in it. Has this research and writing and getting to know Ruth Asawa so well changed you in any way?
That is a great question, and thank you for asking it. You're the first person in 18 months and over, 50 to 60 some talks that has asked that question. And the answer is actually yes. And I'll tell you, it has to do a little bit with my writing style. As a writer, as a journalist especially, my editors were constantly telling me to pare down and to simplify my writing style. I was an English major as an undergrad, and so I tend to try to wax poetic a little too much. And when I met the character of Ruth Asawa and I began to study her work and her work style and her style of speaking and writing, I came to believe that I could only do her justice if I aimed for a more simple, lucid, pared down writing style that did her style justice. Because I thought it would be intellectually and artistically, not quite dishonest, but artificial of me if I didn't adopt a style that honored her spirit. I hope that makes sense.
Yes.
So yeah, it did. Studying Ruth did change me. I'm not sure whether it's a permanent change. We'll have to see what I write next. But thank you for asking that. It's a challenging question and it's a really good one. And I also, I guess in another way too, studying Ruth's life, studying a life of real hardship. I mean, from birth, from having diphtheria at age 3, from living on a farm and working from dawn till dusk, from being hurled into the maelstrom of World War II, and then coming out to face the scourge of racism and fearlessly taking on social prejudice in her mixed marriage, her intermarriage, and in combining her art and her life and giving equal time to her family and her sculpture, it made me realize that these challenges, these challenges of juggling all of the facets of our lives are not not unique to us, that they're things that people have dealt with before, and in the case of Ruth Asawa, dealt with so beautifully, that it's just an inspiration. And I think studying her example kind of sustained me during the pandemic. It made me realize that as much as we feel we've had to make accommodations and face restrictions during this time, others have surmounted so much more.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. That was a wonderful answer too. Great question, great
Yeah, I
answer.
know.
Yes.
What a wonderful way to
Well,
wrap up.
thank you all for having me. I think this is just awesome. Thank you also for tolerating my hoarse voice. I have allergies, and so I'm relying on hot tea to try to get me through. So I hope I didn't hurt your ears.
We
No,
wouldn't
didn't
even have
even notice.
noticed. And so just quickly before everyone vanishes on us, next month we are virtually traveling to the administration offices of Providence Community Library, and our lovely director, Cheryl Space, will be co-hosting, and we'll be reading the graphic memoir, The Best We Could Do by T. Bowie. And this is another quite a similar in some ways, but another like journey of survival. So we're following on the trend. So that's Monday, September 13th, and I put the information in the chat. So again, thank you, Marilyn, so much. Thanks, Lee and Kevin.
Excellent. Thank
Thanks
you.
everyone for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Have
See
a
you all-
lovely night.
See you next month.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilyn. Appreciate it.